Have you ever paused long enough to question whether what people call love is, in many cases, nothing more than a refined fear of solitude? What if the urge to be with someone is not truly about connection, but about escaping the quiet confrontation with your own inner emptiness? And what if relationships, as they are often lived, are less about union and more about distraction, a carefully constructed detour away from yourself? There is something unsettling about silence, about being left alone with your thoughts, because in that stillness there is nowhere left to hide. Carl Jung once invited us to imagine a final moment lying at the edge of life, when everything external fades and only one question remains, simple yet devastating. Did you live as yourself, or did you merely orbit around someone else's existence? That question does not shout, it whispers, but it cuts deeper than any accusation. From an early age, we are handed a script that feels almost sacred. Find someone, build a life together, grow old side by side. It sounds comforting, even noble. But hidden beneath that script is a quiet cost that few are taught to see. Along the way, pieces of the self begin to dissolve. Dreams are postponed, desires are softened, instincts are silenced. Not all at once, but gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you have become someone more acceptable than authentic. Jung did not reject love itself, but he was deeply critical of anything that demanded the erosion of individuality, because the process of becoming who you truly are does not negotiate, and it certainly does not thrive under constant compromise. Society, however, has little patience for those who choose solitude. It labels them quickly, sometimes subtly, sometimes harshly. You are told you are incomplete, that something must be wrong, that happiness requires another person. These statements are repeated so often that they begin to sound like truth, but they are often rooted more in collective fear than in wisdom. What if fulfillment is not about finding someone who completes you, but about becoming someone who does not need completion? That idea feels radical, even uncomfortable, because it shifts responsibility inward. It removes the illusion that another person will save you from your own uncertainty. Most people do not consciously choose relationships from a place of wholeness. They enter them from a place of lack. They cling, not because they love deeply, but because they fear being alone. The other becomes a shield, a distraction, a source of temporary relief from internal tension. This is the illusion Jung warned about, the belief that someone else can resolve what we refuse to face within ourselves. At first, everything feels alive. There is excitement, warmth, a sense of meaning. But slowly, adaptation begins. You soften your opinions, adjust your behavior, silence certain impulses. You call it growth. You call it compromise. But beneath that surface, something essential begins to fade. Over time, that fading becomes difficult to notice because it happens in small increments. A thought you choose not to express, a desire you postpone, a part of yourself you hide to maintain harmony. None of these seem significant in isolation, but together they create a pattern of self-abandonment. One day, you wake up and realize that you are no longer fully present in your own life. You have become a version of yourself designed to maintain stability rather than truth. Jung saw this not as love, but as surrender, the surrender of autonomy, creativity, and the inner tension necessary for real transformation. Romantic ideals often promote the idea of merging identities, of becoming one with another person. While it sounds poetic, this fusion can quietly suffocate the very qualities that make you alive. The chaos of your individuality, your contradictions, your intensity, all of it gets smoothed out in the name of compatibility. But it is precisely that chaos that fuels creativity and growth. Without it, life becomes predictable, controlled, and ultimately diminished. A person can only fully encounter themselves in solitude, because only in that space are they free from the subtle pressure to adjust. This does not mean that relationships are inherently harmful. It means that most people enter them without awareness of the psychological cost. Many couples appear stable on the surface, but beneath that stability are silent compromises. There are conversations never had, truths never spoken, desires quietly buried. What looks like peace is often just the absence of conflict, and what appears to be harmony can sometimes be a carefully maintained illusion. Jung understood that such arrangements can become restrictive, not because they are malicious, but because they discourage the full expression of the self. Think about what it takes for the mind to expand. It requires space, silence, and the freedom to explore without interruption. Yet, relationships often demand constant adjustment. Decisions become shared, time becomes negotiated, and even thoughts can feel influenced by the presence of another. This creates a subtle but persistent tension, an internal filtering system where you begin to measure your authenticity against the stability of the relationship. Over time, this can lead to fragmentation, where parts of yourself are externalized or suppressed in order to maintain balance. Jung warned about the danger of projecting onto others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. Qualities like sensitivity, strength, or vulnerability are often attributed to a partner instead of being integrated internally. This creates dependence because you begin to rely on another person to hold aspects of your identity. But true development requires reclaiming those projections, bringing them back into yourself. And that process is almost impossible if you're constantly distracted by the presence and expectations of another. The kind of love Jung pointed toward was not based on dependency or fusion, but on a deeper alignment with one's own path. It begins when you stop searching externally for what must be discovered internally. This requires courage, because it means facing yourself without distraction. It means sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it. And it means accepting that solitude is not a failure, but a necessary condition for becoming whole. Many people avoid this path because it feels uncertain. Freedom sounds appealing in theory, but in reality, it comes without guarantees. There is no script to follow, no external validation to rely on. Jung understood that true freedom requires letting go of what society values most: belonging, approval, and emotional security. This is not a comfortable process. It can feel isolating, even disorienting, because it removes the structures that most people depend on. Solitude, in this sense, is not simply being alone. It is a confrontation with yourself. It is a space where distractions fall away, and what remains is raw and unfiltered. For many, this is overwhelming, which is why they prefer constant connection, even if it lacks depth. Modern culture encourages this avoidance. It rewards visibility, constant communication, and the appearance of connection, but rarely teaches how to be alone without feeling empty. Jung did not believe that everyone was ready for this level of introspection. He saw it as a path for those willing to question deeply and endure discomfort. Most people prefer direction over freedom because direction provides certainty. Freedom, on the other hand, demands responsibility. It requires you to make decisions without external approval, to trust your own judgment, even when it contradicts social expectations. When you begin to step away from the familiar patterns of dependence, others may not understand. They may interpret your distance as rejection or your independence as coldness. But what is really happening is a shift in orientation. You are no longer seeking validation externally. You are turning inward, trying to understand yourself without interference. This can feel lonely, but it is also where clarity begins to emerge. There is a cost to this path. You may lose certain relationships, or at least the version of them that depended on your conformity. You may feel disconnected from environments that once felt comfortable. But in exchange, you gain something far more fundamental, a direct relationship with yourself. You begin to see your patterns, your fears, your desires without distortion. Jung lived this process in a very real way. He did not arrive at his ideas through comfort or consensus. He spent long periods alone exploring his inner world with intensity. His work was not the result of external validation, but of deep internal inquiry. He understood that to uncover something genuine, one must be willing to face uncertainty and even discomfort without retreating. Solitude, when chosen consciously, becomes a space of transformation rather than isolation. It allows thoughts to develop without interruption, emotions to be processed without distraction, and identity to take shape without external pressure. It is not about rejecting others, but about creating the conditions necessary for authenticity. And perhaps the most important question remains, one that cannot be answered casually. Do you truly seek connection, or are you trying to escape yourself? Because the answer to that question determines everything that follows. There is a hidden cost to freedom that very few are willing to confront directly. It is easy to admire independence from a distance, to romanticize the idea of living on your own terms. But when that independence becomes real, when it strips away comfort and certainty, most people retreat. Carl Jung understood that true freedom is not an aesthetic choice or a philosophical pose. It is a psychological rupture. To be truly free, you must be willing to let go of belonging, of approval, and of the quiet reassurance that someone else is there to stabilize your existence. And for most, that price feels too high. Solitude, in this deeper sense, is not a trend or a temporary phase. It is a testing ground. It exposes the parts of you that have been shaped by others, the habits you adopted to be accepted, the roles you learned to play in order to feel secure. Without those external structures, you're left with something raw and often unfamiliar. This is why so many people fill their lives with noise, constant interaction, endless distractions, not because they are fulfilled, but because silence would force them to confront what they have avoided for years. Jung saw solitude not as a punishment, but as a necessary condition for transformation. It is in that space that the individual begins to separate from collective expectations. It is there that a person stops reacting and begins to create. But this process is not gentle. It often involves loss. Relationships shift. Sometimes they dissolve entirely. Familiar patterns break down. And in that breakdown, there is a period of uncertainty that can feel like disorientation. But it is also the beginning of something more authentic. Many people misunderstand this stage. They interpret it as failure or loneliness, when in reality, it is a form of psychological reorganization. The identity that was built around external validation begins to collapse, making room for something more stable, something that does not depend on constant reassurance. Jung referred to this as the process of individuation, the movement toward becoming a complete and self-sustained individual. But this process cannot occur in an environment where you are constantly adapting to meet the expectations of others. Freedom demands a kind of renunciation that is difficult to articulate. It is not about rejecting others entirely, but about releasing the need to be defined by them. You let go of the idea that someone must always be there, that your life must follow a shared trajectory, that your decisions must be approved or understood. And in that release, something shifts internally. You begin to act not out of fear, but out of alignment. Jung himself embodied this path. He was often misunderstood, sometimes isolated, but he remained committed to his exploration of the psyche. He did not prioritize comfort or social acceptance. Instead, he chose depth, even when that depth led him into uncertain territory. His work was born not from consensus, but from solitude, from a willingness to sit with ideas that were difficult, even unsettling. There is also a truth about relationships that is rarely discussed openly. While they can provide companionship and support, they also introduce a constant layer of negotiation. Every decision, no matter how small, becomes part of a shared dynamic. Over time, this can dilute the intensity of individual purpose. A person with a strong inner drive may find that their energy becomes divided, their focus fragmented between personal vision and relational obligations. This is particularly evident in creative or introspective individuals. The kind of thinking that leads to deep insight requires uninterrupted space. It requires the freedom to explore without explanation, to follow a line of thought wherever it leads without having to justify it. But in most relationships, there is an expectation of availability, of emotional presence, of shared attention. These expectations are not inherently wrong, but they can interfere with a kind of internal work that demands solitude. Imagine trying to sustain a complex train of thought while also managing the emotional needs of another person. The mind is forced to shift constantly, to interrupt itself, to accommodate external demands. Over time, this creates a pattern where deeper thinking is postponed or abandoned altogether, not because it lacks value, but because it does not fit easily into the structure of shared life. Jung would argue that this constant interruption acts as a subtle erosion of the will. It does not happen dramatically, but gradually. The drive to explore, to question, to create begins to weaken. It is replaced by routine, by predictability, by a form of stability that feels safe but limits growth. Many people accept this trade-off without fully recognizing it. They assume it is simply part of adulthood, part of being responsible, but beneath that assumption, there is often a quiet sense of something lost. The solitary individual, however, makes a different choice. They prioritize the conditions necessary for their own development, even if it means sacrificing certain forms of comfort. They accept the absence of constant companionship in exchange for clarity. They accept being misunderstood in exchange for authenticity. This is not an easy path, but it is a deliberate one. There is also a transformation that occurs when you stop relying on others for validation. You become less reactive, less dependent on approval. Your decisions are no longer filtered through the question of how they will be received. Instead, they are guided by an internal standard. This shift can feel unsettling at first because it removes familiar reference points. But over time, it creates a sense of stability that is not easily shaken. Jung emphasized that becoming whole is not about achieving perfection or constant happiness. It is about integration, about acknowledging all parts of yourself, including those that are uncomfortable or difficult. This process requires honesty, and honesty is often easier to access in solitude. Without the pressure to maintain an image or meet expectations, you can see yourself more clearly. There is a moment at some point in this journey when you realize that the life you were taught to pursue does not fully align with who you are. This realization can be quiet or dramatic, but it is unmistakable. You begin to see that many of your choices were influenced by external expectations rather than internal truth. And once you see this, it becomes difficult to return to those patterns without a sense of compromise. At this stage, a decision must be made, not necessarily in a single moment, but through a series of actions. Do you continue to live according to expectations, or do you begin to shape your life around your own understanding? This choice is not without consequence. It may lead to conflict, to misunderstanding, to a sense of isolation. But it also opens the possibility of living with integrity. Choosing yourself is often misunderstood as selfishness. But there is a difference between neglecting others and refusing to abandon yourself. Jung made it clear that the greatest responsibility is not to meet every external expectation, but to become who you are capable of being. This does not mean rejecting all relationships, but it does mean refusing to lose yourself within them. When you begin to live in this way, something changes in how you relate to others. You're no longer seeking someone to complete you. Instead, you engage from a place of fullness. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on dependency, but on mutual recognition. However, reaching this point requires first learning to stand alone. There is also a kind of strength that emerges from solitude. It is not loud or aggressive, but steady. You become less easily influenced, less prone to compromise your values for acceptance. You develop a resilience that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes how you respond to it. Jung often spoke about the importance of confronting the darker aspects of the psyche. This confrontation cannot be outsourced. It cannot be avoided through constant distraction. It requires direct engagement, a willingness to see what you might prefer to ignore. Solitude provides the space for this confrontation to occur. Without it, the shadow remains hidden, influencing behavior in ways that are not fully understood. As this process unfolds, your relationship with yourself becomes more stable. You're no longer defined by roles or expectations. You're not constantly adjusting to maintain harmony. Instead, you begin to act from a place of coherence. Your actions align more closely with your values, your thoughts with your intentions. There is a clarity that comes with this alignment. Decisions become simpler, not because they are easier, but because they are no longer clouded by the need for approval. You know why you're doing what you're doing, and that sense of purpose provides a kind of direction that does not depend on external validation. In the end, the path Jung pointed toward is not about rejecting love or connection. It is about ensuring that those connections do not come at the cost of your own integrity. It is about recognizing that true fulfillment cannot be found in another person, but must be developed internally. There comes a moment when you understand that being alone is not the same as being empty. It is simply being with yourself without distraction. And in that space, something begins to form. A sense of identity that is not dependent on others. A sense of purpose that is not dictated by expectation. If you have followed this reflection to this point, it is likely because something within you resonates with it. Not necessarily as a complete answer, but as a possibility. A different way of living. One that prioritizes authenticity over comfort, depth over convenience. The world will continue to promote connection as the ultimate goal. It will continue to suggest that fulfillment lies in finding the right person. But there is another perspective, quieter, less visible, but no less valid. That fulfillment comes from becoming the person you're meant to be, regardless of whether someone else is there to witness it. And perhaps that is the real question, the one that remains when everything else falls away. Are you willing to face yourself fully without distraction, without escape? Because in that willingness lies the beginning of everything Jung was pointing toward.